morning, awesome people. Welcome to my channel, guys. Adam Burwell. If you're new, please consider subscribing below. And this video is one of your requests. This is how the US told the Philippines. Quite an interesting title, to say the least. And this was dropped on a channel with the account of Johnny Harris. I'll be putting the video link in the description box so that you can watch for yourself later on without any interruptions. With that being said, let's watch this video right about now. Here we go, there it is. Let's start.
There is a cluster of 7,000 islands that looks like one of the most beautiful places on Earth. People have been living here for over 30,000 years, traveling between these islands, trading with each other and with the region, and developing religion, identity, and culture. It eventually became a country called Mai. And while all of these advancements were happening here on these islands,
I didn't know that. And I'm Filipino, obviously.
Another group of humans had been evolving in another part of the world, over here in Europe. But this other group had a different culture, a different religion. Many of their advancements were achieved through expansion, not collaboration. And their religion thrived when they stomped out others. They wanted to conquer. These islands, these people, this culture would soon be swallowed, stripped of what made them them. And soon their name would be changed, after the name of the king of their conquerors.
That I know.
This isn't a story just about a big, powerful military taking over new lands. We know that story pretty well. The story of these people offers a new perspective to anyone who will listen. It's a perspective that has been wiped from our history books because of the inherent discomfort and tension with this fact that the United States, once a colony that heroically threw off an empire to become independent, soon became an empire itself. It contradicts our founding belief that it is, quote, self-evident that all men are created equal. And this story isn't just history. That empire still exists today, with colonial possessions and subjects.
What?
It's all wrapped up in the story of these 7,000 islands and their people. So, I want to tell you the story of how the US stole the Philippines.
There are still American citizens
That was quite an intro, I must say.
today who do not have equal voting rights. These are citizens of America's island territory.
The U.S. Constitution grants citizenship to everyone born on U.S. soil except in one jurisdiction.
Quick pause, because I want to tell you about something that is important.
Okay, this
to me
video is
and
actually
happens
sponsored.
also
Let's just try to maybe
BetterHelp.
fast
I'm a big
forward a
believer
little bit.
in Therapy by certified professional therapists. Therapy. Help.com/Johnny Harris. Going to that link.
Better
will
help.
give you 10%
Okay.
off your first month with BetterHelp if you want to get started today. So let's get back to the video. This video could be called How Spain Stole the Philippines, since Spain was the first nation to conquer
Yes.
and control these islands like 500 years ago. Actually, exactly 500 years ago. And indeed, Spain left a very deep influence on these islands, not least the name itself, which is named after King Philip. Spain brought their religion, their language, their culture, which is why the most common last names in the Philippines are like Reyes or Del Rosario, De la Cruz, De los Santos. But the heyday
Baruel.
of the Spanish Empire came and went, and by the 1800s, it was kind of crumbling. But it was the arrival of a new superpower that I believe had a bigger imprint, not just on the Philippines, but on the US itself. It established rules and behaviors that we still grapple with today, and that's why this is the story of how the US stole the Philippines. So let's go.
To this day, we can see the traces of the almost 400 years of Spanish rule over the Philippines. But even more striking is the more recent influence of the United States.
Okay, so it's the end of the 1800s. Up until now, US expansion sort of looks like this. It's all happening on this mainland. And at this point, there sort of became a big debate of like, do Do we keep going? Some people wanted to keep expanding the US outside of this mainland. The president at the time wasn't a big expansion guy, but he was surrounded by people who loved war. Specifically this guy. And these people who surrounded the president had their eye on this Spanish colony right off the American coast called Cuba, where the locals were rising up against Spain. Wait a minute, isn't this a video about the Philippines? Why are we talking about Cuba? We're getting there in just a second, okay? So anyway, Cuba. Americans didn't want to go to war with Cuba. They're like, we don't need more war. But thanks to the explosion of an American submarine in Cuba, which was probably an accident, and thanks to some highly unethical journalism that blamed the explosion on Spain, and a big thanks to, again, this guy, Teddy Roosevelt, who at this point was just a peon. He was literally the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But he somehow cajoled his boss's boss, the President of the United States, to go to war in Cuba to, liberate the Cubans from Spain. So the U.S. declared war on Spain in 1898. But this begins a new era of war in the United States. No longer can you just go into war and just, take over land. You need an angle. You need to sell the war to the American people. So the angle on this war was liberation. We're liberating the people.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
No. That's later. We're talking about 1898. But yes, the whole idea of selling war to the American public.
It's like sugarcoating. It's a fancy word so that the American public will buy it.
Didn't really go away after this. Why
And
did
agree
the
with
US
it, I
go
guess.
to war in Iraq?
The early stages of military operations.
So anyway, the U.S. is now at war with Spain, which is an empire that is deeply in decline, as I mentioned. It's not going to be hard to win. But soon, it's not just Cuba. The U.S., really meaning Teddy Roosevelt, who again is just an assistant secretary of the Navy. He's not a big decision maker. He somehow maneuvers the situation to say, let's liberate next door Puerto Rico. And while we're at it, let's go into the Pacific and liberate Guam and the Philippines from Spain as well. Teddy didn't even ask his boss to do this. He literally sent off a cable to the Navy commander in Asia that was like, George Dewey, go attack the Philippines where Spain is. That is what your mandate is. And George Dewey's like, okay, I'm being told to go to war with Spain and the Philippines. Teddy was sort of the mind, better to ask forgiveness than permission. I get that, but kind of nuts that he pulled it off. Anyway, and now because of Teddy Roosevelt, who we literally named the teddy bear after, side note, we're at war not in the Caribbean only, but also in the Pacific. The U.S. arrives to the Philippines and sees that the locals had already been fighting against the Spanish for years. The Spanish were weak and were totally declining. So it's the top of the ninth inning, or the fourth quarter of the Spanish in the Philippines.
It's crunch
and the
time.
U.S. shows up and is let us liberate you. And the Philippines were well, we've sort of already been fighting this bloody war for years against the Spanish. So yeah, I guess, United States, if you want to come help us deal the final blow to Spain, sweet. So George Dewey, this Navy commander, and his fleet show up to Manila. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., people are wait, weren't we just supposed to invade Cuba? What are we doing in the Philippines now? And the U.S. government's because the Philippines is a perfect hub for commercial opportunities in Asia, and we think that if we don't take it, Japan or Germany might take it, which would clearly diminish our geostrategic advantage in the Pacific. No, they didn't say that. They said, we want to liberate the people of the Philippines. Liberate.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
Now that's
So
the
the
selling
Spanish
angle.
see the U.S. arrive to the Philippines, and they're great, we're done. So the Spanish military commanders ask to meet with the U.S. military commanders. They meet in secret, and Spain's listen, I know we're losing, but we really want to save some face here. We don't want it to look like we lost to the Filipino revolutionaries. And I'm not kidding. The Spanish commander literally said that he would, quote, be willing to surrender to white people, but not to the Filipinos.
Oh my God.
So the U.S. commander's okay, there's an opportunity here. We said we were here to liberate the Filipinos, but we haven't promised anything yet. So we would much rather it look like the U.S. defeated Spain instead of
This
help
is
the Filipinos defeat Spain.
something
Much
else.
better for our brand, said the United States. So together, the United States and Spanish militaries organized a fake battle. A fake battle in which the U.S. would fight the Spanish in Manila, and the Spanish would intentionally lose. And the climax of this whole theatrical battle, according to the plan, was that at the end, the U.S. would storm towards the inner walled city of Manila, the last stronghold of where the Spanish are. Oh, and the key detail in this whole plan, they would not let the Filipino fighters, the ones that had been doing all the
Intramuros,
actual
that's
fighting
the walled
against the
city, I
Spanish,
guess.
join them as they stormed towards the walled city to deal the final blows to the Spanish
Oh my
Empire.
God.
And this would mean that the Filipinos technically didn't gain their independence. It's actually the U.S. who conquered the Spanish, and then the Spanish were like, oh, can you give us $20 million for our troubles? And the U.S. was like, yeah, sure. So now the U.S. wins the war, and they claim sovereignty over the Philippines.
Oh my God! If I remember correctly, there's a word in my history, as far as I can remember, the word annex. I think it has something to do with like buying the Philippines from Spain.
So yeah, this happened. They did the fake battle.
I could be
they
wrong.
won the war. Instead of liberating the Filipinos, they just say, hey, we're your new colonizers. Psych. Meanwhile, back in the United States, they got to keep up this white savior liberation narrative that they created to justify going to war with Spain. So you see a lot more theatrical PR by the government. They staged this giant military parade in New York City, where this military commander who did the fake war, George Dewey, marches down. They called it Dewey Day. It was like a 2-day parade in New York City. They created a big military arch for him. The U.S. now owns Puerto Rico, Guam, and they claim the Philippines. But the local Filipinos who've been fighting for their freedom for years are like, no. You just waltzed in here on our rebellion and conspired with the Spanish to make it look like you were liberating us.
It was like
no,
a
this is our
business
country. We don't need
agreement.
another colonizer. And this is where things really heat up.
So is America a thief? That
The Filipinos
is
start
what seems to
fighting
be
again for their independence, and this time against the
He
United
is
States.
giving
It is
us
a pretty
here.
horrible, bloody war, one that I never learned about in school. It included massacres of men, women, and children by the United States, and hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. But the U.S. eventually won, and they established a government in the Philippines. Back in the U.S., the appetite for expansion continued to go down, and people sort of just forgot about the Philippines. They forgot that there was a war there. One newspaper summed it up by saying, Americans didn't know if the Philippines were islands or canned fruit. But the fact remained that the
Canned
U.S.
goods,
went to
canned
war
fruits.
and now owned the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam. So this begged a very important question, one that hadn't been asked before, which is all of this land America? Are
Guam,
these
Puerto
people
Rico,
Americans?
the
This was a
Philippines.
huge question. And the answer to that question affects how we see these territories still today. Okay, so a few years after these wars, there's a guy in New York City who's importing oranges from one of these territories, Puerto Rico. And he's paying tariffs on these imports because, that's what you do when you're importing oranges from another country. Wait a minute. Another country?
But
This guy
isn't
was like,
Puerto Rico a part of?
Didn't we conquer Puerto Rico and
Yeah.
Guam and the Philippines? Isn't that America? The Constitution says that you can't put tariffs on stuff coming from other parts of the U.S. Like New Jersey can't put tariffs on avocados from California. So he sued, and his case and a bunch of others like it made it to the Supreme Court. So not
This
fully
is
a
so
part of the
interesting.
country. That was the question that was at stake. And in this series of cases in the early 1900s, the Supreme Court decided that America was the latter, is the latter. They created a new category of land called unincorporated territories, where the
So is
people
that
don't have any
supposed to be
representation
us
in
here in the
democracy,
Philippines?
but where Congress can
Unincorporated
create
territories.
laws on their own, particularly laws dealing with revenue, which would not be allowed by the Constitution for states within the Union. We can create revenue laws, stuff that's totally unconstitutional for other parts of our country. In other words, unincorporated territories are land we control and exploit for revenue, but whose people don't get to vote and
Nope, that
don't
is
get
not
the right
cool
to trial by jury.
at all.
So yeah, the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam, remained unincorporated territories, a place that the U.S. could kind of just ignore without a lot of consequence. They weren't important enough or strategic enough to be considered to become states like Hawaii or Alaska. So they sort of faded from American consciousness. Like, this is why we never heard about this in school.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't make it into the history books in any salient way. And how far the Philippines had faded from people's mind became very
I was
clear
not
in December
expecting
of
this.
1941, during World War II. The U.S. had owned the Philippines Philippines for like 40 years when a fleet of
Yeah,
Japanese
this time it was
bombers flew
Japan.
across the Pacific and bombed an American naval base in Hawaii. But what we don't really remember is on that day, Japan bombed Guam
And the
this
Philippines.
speech. This is the original draft that FDR spent the day marking up before he gave it. Zoom in a little bit, and you'll see on this draft that it mentioned the Philippines originally.
Yes, but it
But
it
FDR
was
crossed it out.
erased.
He crossed out the mention of Manila.
There.
Yes, the Philippines was on some map somewhere. Yes, we technically owned it. But the people really didn't want to hear about it because these people weren't Americans. The Supreme Court had decided that. They weren't going to become states anytime soon. So why mention them? After that day, Japan actually full-on invaded the Philippines. They didn't do that to Hawaii, but they did to the Philippines until the end of the war, at which point the Philippines were finally granted independence in 1946.
I think that was July 4, 1946.
Fast forward to today, and this "we own you, but you're not really Americans" precedent established by the Supreme Court still applies to 4 million people who live in unincorporated territories.
So Guam, Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and U.S. Virgin Islands.
Or let's just call it a spade a spade. Let's call them what they are. These are colonial possessions. The people who live here don't experience the full rule of law. They don't get trial by jury. They don't have full representation in our democracy. And they don't get to vote for the president. This is why when a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, the government response is not nearly what it should be. The way Trump talked about Puerto Rico as almost another country, as not a part of us, mirrors exactly how the Supreme Court talked about these unincorporated territories. They're for revenue, not to compete with American farmers. We conquered these places, but we didn't want to bring the people fully into the American project. We left them out. And there they remain today.
This is just like so interesting, and I don't know if it's true. So is America a thief? Was it all just a business agreement? But yeah, somehow I would say though that war sometimes is just like, on top of it being political, then it's still business. Guys, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'm just like quite shocked here. And you know what? Thank you so much for requesting this. I'll see you in my next upload, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.